Hi, my name is Adrian from La Rebellion. Stay there. I'm going to show you 3 different ways to configure your Kubernetes cluster to be accessible from remote PCs. Installing Kubernetes in a remote machine can be complex and time-consuming, but hold on. After you complete this odyssey, your first disappointment will be that you cannot access that cluster from a remote machine, let's say your PC. By default, the Kubernetes cluster is configured to enable the access to the API server only for local machine, for security reasons. If unauthorized users access the API server, they could manipulate the state of the cluster and even delete some resources or install malicious applications. Therefore, limiting the access to the API server by default is a measurement to avoid this unauthorized access. If you want and if you need to configure your cluster to be accessible from remote PCs, stay here. I will show you how to do that. I'm going to show you 3 different ways to configure your cluster to be accessible. Let's see. Okay, it's time to configure your Kubernetes cluster to be accessible from remote machines. Let's see. If you try to access your Kubernetes cluster from your PC, you will realize that this is not going to be enabled. Why? Okay, as I explained, for security reasons, this is configured to be accessible only from localhost. So if you try to run this from external system, you won't be able to get that. But if you do that directly from the cluster, you are going to be able to access. I'm going to configure my KS to enable this remote access. From the documentation, first of all, we need to update the certificate. The certificate will allow us to add an extra DNS FQDN for that to be able to configure this external access. Once you configure an FQDN to the internet or just a local FQDN, you can configure your etc host with that FQDN and then use the IP of your cluster, and of course that will be more than enough for you to access the cluster from external machines. As you can see here, we have the microKS, the FQDN that we configure in the certificate, and with that remotely we can just access the API. MicroKS, once it's installed, it provides you with a kubeconfig for a client. So let's copy that from the cluster into your local PC, and with that you will have default kubeconfig created by MicroKS. Once you copy or download that file, you can just use that as a parameter in your kubectl command, and with that you should be able to access the API. We are now able to access the Kubernetes cluster API from remote PC. Some other examples: get pods, get namespaces, that's it. Another way to enable the access is with tokens. Let's execute the commands to create. We will need to create a service account, let's say Rebel SA, and once that service account is created, we will need to create a token. We will need to create a token based on that service account, and this is the command. With that, we will get a token that you can use in your headers for, let's say, curl, or you can use that token as well as parameter in the kubectl command. Get pods. get secrets. Here you have it. We have access to the cluster with tokens. Now let's create a certificate, a new certificate, because eventually you may need to add more users to your cluster. For that, let's create a namespace, and then for that namespace, let's create a role and a role binding for that. Just pay attention on this kind here, the user. This user is the one that you have, that you are going to create in the cluster. And this is nothing related with the kubectl user that you have in your kubeconfig file. That is a different user. You can use different username in the file. What it is important is the username that you use here in the cluster with the role binding. And let's create the certificate. And as you can see here in the subject, we are going to use in the CN, in the common name, the username. This is the username that is going to be validated in the server to see if that user has access or not. Okay, now that we have the certificate created, let's create that for just 3 days. And that's it. We have the common name rebel. Now that we have the key and the certificate for your client or your remote users, let's copy that. In my case, multipass transfer, but you can use an FTP or SCP to transfer those files. Once that I have that locally in my PC, let's create a kubeconfig for the user. I'm going to use the 2 files that we took from the server that we generate with OpenSSL. And with that, I'm going to encode the certificate and just paste that string here in the kubeconfig. Okay, let's change the FQDN. The FQDN is the one that we created before, and as I said, let's encode the keys, and once the key and the certificate. Once we encode base 64, we just use that in the config file. And that's it. You can see here I have a user admin, but that doesn't mean that my user in the cluster is admin. It's just the placeholder here in the file. Okay, with that file, that's it. We have now access to the cluster with the file that we just generated with the new user. Of course, there are no resources in the default namespace. But if I get the namespaces, here you have it. All the namespaces that we have in the cluster. With that, we enable the user to access the Kubernetes API server, and the user has access to everything, and we don't want that. Of course, for security reasons, you may want different users to access different namespaces, different resources. So let's enable the RBAC configuration in the cluster. Now let's try again to get the namespaces with the same exact command that we executed before. And here you have it, error from server. We don't have access to the pods either in the default namespace. But let's change our file to, by default in the context, access the namespace of Laravel. With that, we should have access to that. Let's execute that using the file, and that's it. There are no resources, so we have access, but there are no resources in that namespace. But if I get the namespaces again, now I'm not able to do so. The user cannot access the namespaces. Okay, that's all. We have configured our cluster to be accessible from remote machines. From here, of course, you may add extra configuration for your RBAC or whatever you may need. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Thank you.